They say that before death, a person sees their entire life flash before their eyes. But what do they see when death stares them in the face and they refuse to give up? We all look over the edge of a precipice and imagine what it would be like to take that step forward. But what happens to those who actually decide to do it? Every abyss has its own voice. An abandoned bus in the middle of the Alaskan taiga whispered of freedom, but said nothing of hunger. 1,000 feet of free fall screamed of extreme danger, but gave no warning of the broken knot. A mountain slope in Taiwan beckoned with Instagram fame, but hid the price of the last shot. 5 different fates, 5 different elements, but one lesson. Nature does not forgive hubris and does not make allowances for human ambition. Each of the heroes of these stories crossed an invisible line. But what happens to a person when they find themselves beyond the boundaries of comfort, safety, and the familiar world? These 5 journeys alone with the elements change not only their destinies, but also our understanding of what the human spirit is capable of when cornered. It all starts with a mystery. Why did a prestigious university graduate burn all his money, tear up his documents, and flee to the wilds of Alaska? What was he looking for where civilization ends and survival becomes a daily struggle? In September 1992, a group of hunters, deep into the Alaskan wilderness, discovered an abandoned bus. A note was pinned to its door, a desperate plea for help written by a trembling hand on a torn page of a book. An unknown traveler was calling out to random passers-by, begging them to save him. He wrote that he was deathly ill, too weak to go on, and all alone. What they discovered inside would forever change the perception of how far a person could go in search of freedom. At that moment, no one knew yet that this story would become one of the most talked about wilderness survival dramas. A story about dreams and their collision with reality, about the fine line between bravery and recklessness. The story of a man whose name would later become known around the world. In late April 1992, spring was just beginning in Alaska. The Stampede Trail, where this story unfolds, lies 20 miles from the small town of Healy, the last outpost before the vast Alaskan wilderness. There are no permanent residents here, only rare hunters and occasional travelers. In these parts, nature does not forgive mistakes. Sharp temperature changes require careful preparation and knowledge of the terrain. The rivers fed by meltwater become treacherous traps. Their flow increases, and fords, passed in winter on ice, turn into turbulent streams. Wild animals, grizzly bears, moose, wolves, make these places even more dangerous. The seeming serenity of spring nature hides the harsh reality of the land, where man is only a guest, and any mistake can cost a life. It is here, in the heart of the Alaskan wilderness, that a young man whose story will change the perception of what people are capable of in search of their dreams. Christopher McCandless, a 24-year-old university graduate, has always stood out among his peers. An intellectual, an athlete, an honors student. Outwardly, he was the embodiment of the American dream. Born into a well-to-do family and educated at the prestigious Emory University, he had everything that young people usually aspire to. But behind this facade of a successful life was a man who saw the world differently. Even as a student, Chris displayed traits unusual for his environment. He could eat rice for weeks, although he had money for pocket money. He refused to wear new clothes, preferring old jeans and shirts. His room could barely hold one backpack. He was an avid book lover, especially attracted to the works of such writers as Thoreau, Tolstoy, and London, finding in their works a reflection of his own thoughts about freedom, honesty, and simplicity of life. In May 1990, just after graduating from university, Chris made a move that shocked everyone who knew him. He donated all his savings, $24,000, to charity. He abandoned his car, burned the rest of the cash in his wallet, and left home without telling anyone about his plans. He made a clean break with his past life, taking on a new name, Alexander Superbug. The next 2 years were a journey not only across the country, but also to himself. He hitchhiked across America, working odd jobs, living a simple life. In South Dakota, he harvested crops. In California, he washed dishes at a diner. In Arizona, he worked at McDonald's. But he didn't stay anywhere for long. As soon as he had some money for food, he was on the road again. Those few who got to know him better during these wanderings spoke about the amazing combination of firmness of convictions and softness in communication. He could talk for hours about literature or philosophy, but never imposed his opinions. While possessing an attractive charisma, he nevertheless avoided deep attachments, as if he feared they might become an anchor keeping him from his main goal. His goal was absolute freedom. Freedom from money, from obligations, from the conventions of society. He longed for a pure, uncluttered experience of life, where one is alone with nature and oneself. In his mind, Alaska was not just a destination. It was a symbol of this freedom, the last frontier where true wilderness could still be found. On April 28, 1992, local electrician Jim Gallion picked up a young hitchhiker on the highway. The guy was dressed lightly, worn jeans, thin jacket, old sneakers. He carried only a small backpack and a rifle. He introduced himself as Alex and asked for a ride to the beginning of the Stampede Trail. On the way, they got to talking. Gallion, an experienced Alaskan, noted with dismay how little gear his traveling companion had. 10 pounds of rice, a light sleeping bag, a few books. That was all the luggage for life in the wilderness. No warm clothes, no map of the terrain, no compass. When Gallion offered to buy him the necessary equipment and food, the boy politely but firmly refused. He had a philosophy of testing himself against the wilderness, relying only on his own strength. Stopping at the beginning of the trail, Gallion tried one last time to dissuade his strange passenger. He spoke of the treachery of spring weather, of sudden changes in the weather, of how easy it was to get lost in these parts. But the young man's gaze was so determined that all arguments seemed powerless. The only thing Alex accepted from Gallion was a pair of rubber boots. Saying goodbye, he asked Gallion to take a picture of him in front of the trail sign. The smiling, enthusiastic young man raised his hand in a parting gesture. What happens after this figure disappears around the bend of the forest trail will be remembered forever by all who come into contact with this story. The first few days of the trip proved challenging. On the second day, Chris fell through the ice, soaked to the skin, but managed to get out and build a fire. In his diary, he briefly noted this episode. Day 2, falling through the ice. But the real good fortune was what happened on the 4th day of the trip. 20 miles from the start of the trail, he discovered an old bus under route number 142. Day 4, the magic bus, he wrote in his journal, unable to hide his joy at the find. The bus had become his home and fortress. Inside, he found an old stove, a few shabby shelves, and even an old mattress. Chris organized the space, creating a semblance of comfort. Books neatly arranged, a sleeping bag spread out by the stove, a homemade shelf for storing supplies. He began to lead a measured life, full of daily cares for food and warmth. Hunting was not easy. With a small rifle of .22 caliber, he could get only small game: squirrels, partridges, occasionally geese. Every day was a struggle for food, but Chris felt truly alive. Not all was rosy, however. The nights were still cold, and the spring rains were turning the neighborhood into a swamp. The mosquitoes that came with the warming temperatures made life a constant battle. The broken windows of the bus let in hordes of insects from which there was no escape even at night. The first notes of fatigue appear in the diary. Day 14, suffering. But there were also joyful moments. Towards the end of the month, he managed to shoot a wild duck. Day 31, tasty duck. A triumphant entry in his diary marked this little hunting triumph. But the main challenge was becoming loneliness. For a man who had spent the last 2 years in constant motion, meeting new people in roadside cafes, on farms, and in small towns. This absolute isolation was particularly acute. Whereas before he could talk for hours with random fellow travelers or share his thoughts with those who gave him work, now his only interlocutors were books. Thoreau, Tolstoy, London. Chris spent hours reading, making notes in the margins, thinking. In his diary, he increasingly philosophized about the meaning of life, about freedom, about the nature of the human spirit. By the end of May 1992, nature was generous. More game appeared, berry bushes bloomed, the days became warmer. Chris adapted to life in the wilderness, learned to read animal tracks, to find edible plants. He took pictures of his life, posing with his prey, reading by the fire, standing in front of the bus with his arm raised. He smiles in all the pictures, but his figure is getting thinner and thinner. On his 43rd day in the wilderness, an event occurred that would change everything. Chris had shot an elk, a huge success for an inexperienced hunter with a small caliber rifle. It was his biggest kill yet and would provide him with food for weeks to come. A triumphant entry in his diary read, Day 43, elk. But the euphoria was quickly replaced by despair. Having no experience in cutting big game and not knowing the right ways to store meat, he made a series of fatal mistakes. In the spring thaw, the meat began to spoil faster than he could process it. Attempts to smoke the prey were unsuccessful. The smoke was too weak, and the meat remained raw inside. Day after day, he watched his grand victory turn into a disaster. The loss of so much valuable meat was a heavy blow to him. It wasn't just a failure to hunt. It was a cruel reminder of how unprepared he was for life in the wild. His diary these days was filled with somber reflections on his own incompetence. By early July '92, Chris had made the decision to leave the bus and return to civilization. 2 months of meager food and a constant struggle for survival had exhausted him physically. His rice supplies were running low. His hunting was becoming less and less successful. Each day he needed more strength to get food and less energy. After the disaster with the elk, it became clear that his skills were not sufficient for long-term survival in these parts. After gathering his few belongings, he set off on his return journey. But nature had a harsh surprise in store for him. The Teclanica River, which he had easily crossed in April on a half-frozen bed, was now an unstoppable torrent. Meltwater from the mountains had turned it into a churning mass more than 65 feet wide. For days, Chris searched for a way to traverse the river. He walked along the bank, trying to find a narrower spot or a natural ford. But everywhere he was met with the same picture: a powerful stream capable of knocking down anyone who ventured into it. In his diary, he wrote, "The rain has driven in. The river seems impassable, lonely, frightening." On July 8th, after several unsuccessful attempts to find a crossing, he returned to the bus. How did he feel at that moment? Anger at his unpreparedness? Fear of the unknown? Frustration at the realization that his dream of merging with the wilderness had turned out to be a trap. He didn't know that just a mile downstream was the hand cable crossing marked on the maps he had once refused to take. Now the bus had gone from a shelter to a prison. Supplies were running low, strength was melting away, and the unknown lay ahead. But even at this point, Chris didn't give up. He continued to hunt, to gather plants, to keep a journal. His will to live remained unbroken, though his physical exhaustion was becoming more and more noticeable. After returning to the bus, the situation deteriorated rapidly. Chris's diet became more and more meager. Whereas before he had been able to afford small portions of rice, supplemented with game and berries, now there was barely enough to sustain his strength. Hunting required energy, which was becoming scarce, a vicious circle from which he could not escape. At the end of July, a disturbing entry appeared in his diary. When the rice supply was almost gone, Chris began to look more actively for alternative sources of food. Among the books he took with him was a guide to local plants. Following its directions, he discovered and began collecting the roots and seeds of the wild potato, a plant that the locals had traditionally used for food. But something went wrong. With each passing day, his condition worsened. A diary entry appeared in capital letters, like a last cry for help. Extremely weak. Potato seeds are to blame. Great difficulty just getting up. Starving. Great danger. He attributed his weakness specifically to the seeds of the plant. Chris didn't know that during the ripening period, the seeds can contain a toxin that is particularly dangerous to an emaciated body. His body, already weakened by months of malnutrition, now struggled not only with hunger, but also with possible poisoning. His muscles were thinning rapidly, and every movement was difficult. He continued to search for food in the vicinity of the bus, but more and more often he returned empty-handed. Squirrels and birds, which he had easily obtained before, now seemed out of reach. His hands were shaking, his vision was blurred, he did not have enough strength even to aim. In the first days of August, the entries in his diary became very short. He still noted each day, but now they were just crosses, like a prisoner's calendar, counting down the days until his release. Only occasionally, there were short notes about berries he had found or his state of health. The last extended entry in the diary was dated the 107th day of the bus. Just 2 words, "Beautiful blueberries." In this brief note, the beauty of the world around us and the tragedy of a man for whom a few berries found was an event worthy of a diary entry were remarkably combined. In early August 1992, Chris realized that his situation had become critical. He wrote a desperate message on a torn page from Gogol's book and pinned it to the door of the bus. It was a plea for help, addressed to random travelers. He confessed that he was injured, too weak to get out on his own, and on the verge of death. Emphasizing the phrase, "This is no joke," twice, he begged anyone who found the note to stay and help. Despite his critical condition, he continued to keep a certain routine. Marks continued to appear in the diary, "Beautiful blueberry" being the last text entry in the diary. After it, 6 more days are marked with simple crosses. In these last days, something had changed in his outlook. In the margins of Boris Pasternak's Dr. Zhivago, he left a short but poignant note. Happiness is real only when it is shared with others. For a man who 2 years earlier had withdrawn from society in search of absolute independence, this was a surprising admission. His last photographs show a haggard young man. But even in this state, he found the strength to smile for the camera, holding a homemade poster. On it, he said goodbye, thanked for a wonderful time, and asked not to follow his example. He seemed to have a premonition that his story might inspire other adventurers to take a similar risky path. Day 113 was the last day noted in the diary. After that, the entries stopped. In the sleeping bag that served as his bed, he put his diary, photographs, and documents. Nearby, the books remained, faithful companions of his loneliness, now covered with notes and reflections in the margins. His final resting place had become a kind of time capsule, preserving the story of an extraordinary journey. On September 6, 1992, a group of hunters led by Butch Killian discovered bus number 142. The group planned to use the bus as a temporary shelter, a common practice for hunters in these parts. But what caught their attention was a note on the door, written on a torn-out page of a book. Once inside, they smelled a distinctive pungent odor. In the far corner of the bus, in a sleeping bag, which at first they mistook for a bag of spoiled food, they found the body of a young man. Neatly folded nearby were his identification papers, Christopher Johnson McCandless. The hunters immediately radioed the authorities and the police, and coroner arrived on the scene the next day. The body was so emaciated that one small backpack was sufficient to transport it. The Alaska State Coroner recorded the death as a result of emaciation. The body weighed only 67 pounds. Considering that Chris was a young, healthy man at 5 feet 8 inches tall, this weight spoke to a loss of more than half of his normal body weight. Aside from the obvious emaciation, there were no injuries or signs of violence on the body. This refuted the theory of a possible wild animal attack and confirmed that the word injured in SOS's note reflected his general condition rather than a specific injury. His diary, a camera with film footage, and a library of several books with many marginal notes were found on the bus. The initial theory of the cause of death seemed obvious: ordinary starvation. His diet, which in recent weeks had consisted mostly of berries and the occasional small game, could not provide the calories he needed to survive. The body began to eat itself. First fat stores, then muscle tissue, and finally began to fail at the cellular level. This explained both the weakness and the inability to hunt, a typical vicious cycle of starvation. In 1993, however, journalist John Krakauer, who began his own investigation for Outside Magazine, proposed a different theory. Studying Chris's diary, he paid particular attention to an entry dated July 30th that spoke of weakness caused by wild potato seeds. Krakauer did his own research on the plant, which Chris probably collected from the directions in the guidebook. Krakauer initially speculated that the seeds contained the alkaloid L-canavanine, which could be toxic. However, further research conducted in 2013 with chemist Ronald Hamilton revealed another toxin, beta-ODAP. This neurotoxin, found in seeds during their maturation period, is capable of causing irreversible paralysis known as latarism. Under normal conditions, its concentration is too low to harm a healthy person, but for an emaciated body depleted of fat and protein stores, it could be fatal. That theory would explain the strange dynamics of Chris's decline. Why would a man who had hunted and gathered food successfully for 2 months suddenly become rapidly weaker? Why couldn't even the small amounts of food he had been able to obtain maintain his strength? The toxin from the plant blocks the absorption of nutrients at the cellular level. The body literally starves to death even in the presence of food. However, the scientific community is divided in its assessment of this version. Thomas Clausen, a chemist at the University of Alaska, analyzed seeds collected in the same area in 2007. His research found no dangerous concentrations of either ODAP or other toxins. He claimed the seeds were safe and Chris died simply from starvation. Moreover, locals had been using the plant as food for centuries without any adverse effects. Some experts suggested an alternative version, possible mold poisoning. In the high humidity conditions inside the bus, the seeds or leftover rice could have become covered with a fungus that produces mycotoxins. This theory would also explain the sudden deterioration, but, like the ODAP version, could not be tested because of the cremation of the body. It is more likely that Chris's death was the result of a combination of factors. Prolonged malnutrition had compromised his immune system and his ability to absorb nutrients. Under these conditions, even a small amount of toxins, whether from seeds or mold, could have been the last straw. His body, already on edge, simply couldn't handle the additional strain. The final resolution to this tragedy remained elusive. Chris's body was cremated shortly after discovery, making further research impossible. But perhaps the exact cause of death is not that important. What matters is what happened in those last days of August of '92 on an old bus in Alaska, a profound realization reflected in a note in the margin of the book. Happiness is only real when it is shared with others. On September 13, 1992, the McCandless family received the news that every parent dreads. After 2 years of total uncertainty, they learned of their son's death. The news came from the Alaska State Police. The body had been identified by fingerprints. For the parents, who had been looking for Chris all this time, hiring a private detective, it was a devastating blow. The following summer, Walt and Billy McCandless made a pilgrimage to the site of their son's death. They made their way to the 142 bus, where they spent hours trying to understand the last days of Chris's life. Inside, they left a memorial plaque. Chris, Our beloved son and brother died here in August 1992. Nearby, they placed a first aid kit and a supply of food, as if trying to protect other travelers from their son's fate. Karen, Chris's younger sister, was taking the loss particularly hard. She was the only member of the family with whom he kept in touch after his departure, although he did not reveal his plans. In her memoir, she wrote, "I lost not only my brother, but my best friend. A part of me died with him on that bus." The family agreed to have the body cremated. In July of '92, on what would have been Chris's 25th birthday, they climbed to the top of a mountain in California and scattered his ashes. The place was not chosen by chance. Chris loved the mountains. They symbolized the freedom he so desperately sought. An eagle flew over the mountains that day, symbolizing to the family that Chris's spirit had finally found the freedom he had sought in life. The story of Chris McCandless did not end with his death. John Krakauer's article in Outside Magazine, and then his book Alone with the Wild, made the story known around the world. In 2007, Sean Penn made a movie based on it, which further increased interest in the fate of the young wanderer. Bus number 142 became a place of pilgrimage for thousands of people from all over the world. But this popularity had a dark side. In the years since Chris's death, several people have died trying to reach the bus. Others found themselves in dangerous situations and needed rescuing. The Teclanica River, which stopped Chris, continued to be a deadly obstacle for unprepared travelers. In 2020, Alaskan authorities made a decision. The bus was evacuated by helicopter, putting an end to dangerous pilgrimages. Today, Bus 142 sits in a museum in Fairbanks. Cleaned of rust but still bearing the marks of time, it continues to tell the story of Chris McCandless. A story of the search for self, of the longing for freedom, of the fine line between dreaming and recklessness. Alaskans still argue about Chris's legacy. To some, he is a romantic hero who defied consumer society. To others, he is an untrained idealist whose story should serve as a cautionary tale. But perhaps the truth lies somewhere in the middle. In his latest entry about how happiness is only real when it's shared, Chris seems to have found the answer to the question that has been driving him further and further into the wilderness. It's only a shame that this epiphany came too late. In the end, this story isn't so much about survival or death as it is about the search, about the eternal human quest to find his way, to understand himself and his place in the world. And maybe the main lesson here is not how far one can go in search of freedom, but that true freedom is not running away from the world, but finding oneself in it. In the world of extreme sports, they say the higher you go, the harder it hurts to fall. A truth Dan Osmond learned 1,000 feet above the rocky bottom of Yosemite Park, when one technical miscalculation turned a legend into an eternal lesson. For all its majestic beauty, the world of vertical rock lurks a ruthless truth. Rock climbing is the art of dancing on the edge, where every move can mean triumph or fall. In the late 1980s and 1990s, rock climbing was undergoing a revolution. The cult of extreme sports was taking over young minds, and the boundaries of what was possible were expanding with each new climb. Nowhere was this more evident than at Cave Rock, an ancient volcanic formation overhanging the crystal-clear waters of Lake Tahoe on the California-Nevada border. This natural cave, sacred to the local Washoe tribe, with its overhanging rock ledges and complex vertical walls, has become a major center of attraction and the most coveted destination for a new generation of rock climbers. In the days when the term extreme sport was just entering the mainstream, Cave Rock offered just that, extreme in its purest form. Of particular appeal were the 513 and 514 difficulty routes, categories accessible only to the most technical and daring. The granite walls overhanging the blue of Lake Tahoe at hundreds of feet were not forgiving of mistakes. A fall here meant serious injury or death. The merciless arithmetic of gravity was impossible to ignore. Meanwhile, in Yosemite Valley, 200 miles southwest of Tahoe. The vertical walls of El Capitan and Half Dome had long attracted the world's best climbers. But the real test was Leaning Tower, a sloping granite tower more than 1,000 feet high that seems to defy the laws of physics with its dangerous incline. In this place of pure risk, fate had prepared the final scene for one of the most daring climbers of the era. During these years, extreme culture shaped an entire generation. MTV broadcast commercials with stuntmen and skateboarders, magazines were full of pictures of fearless athletes, and tapes of extreme stunts were passed from hand to hand. The spirit of rebellion and adrenaline addiction defined the era long before social media made such feats commonplace. It was into this world, full of ups and downs, stepped a man whose name has become synonymous with unfathomable courage and tragic fate. A man who took rope, free-flying to previously unattainable heights, both in the literal sense, the height of the jumps, and in the development of the sport itself. This is the story of Dan Osman, carpenter, father, innovator, and seeker of the limits of human possibility. Between triumph and tragedy is just one knot. One moment when 1,000 feet of freefall separates the genius of extreme sports from an encounter with eternity. Dan Osman was born on February 11, 1963. A resident of South Lake Tahoe, he combined his work as a carpenter with an overwhelming passion for rock climbing. At age 14, he climbed cave rock for the first time, clinging to cracks while others played soccer. His life was characterized by remarkable simplicity. A modest apartment, minimal belongings, only the most essential gear. He called himself a slow learner, recalling how he labored for 8 years to reach the expert level. Every day he came to cave rock above the shining surface of Lake Tahoe, spending hours honing his skills on the same routes, memorizing every ledge and crack. Osman's routine was simple. A few months of construction work, then weeks on the rocks. On the construction site I made a living, on the rocks I lived, he told friends. Friends joked that he slept with a carbine under his pillow. The turning point came in the mid-'80s, when Dan met Dave Griffith at Joshua Tree National Park. On a day when Griffith was struggling with an acid crack route, Osman went after him, showing off a couple moves that surprised his older comrade. He had the perfect physique for a climber, Griffith later recalled. Light but strong, with a great strength-to-weight ratio. More important, however, was his mental toughness. His ability to focus in a moment of extreme exertion. By the late 80s, Dan Osman began experimenting with solo ascents without insurance. The Atlantis route in Sequoia National Park became one of his landmark solos, a technically difficult route where the slightest mistake could mean death. Osman, however, had his own take on fear and risk. Solo is just a game, a serious game, but a game. The price of a mistake is your life, so you'd better know exactly what you're doing, he told a friend, and these words became a manifesto of his life philosophy. Behind Osman's reserved character and modesty was depth and complexity. While he did not compete and rarely sought public speaking, he was focused on the inner challenge of overcoming his own limits, rather than defeating others. This quality gave his figure a special significance in a community where ego was often more important than true achievement. By the early 90s, Dan Osman had transformed himself from an unknown climber into a local legend, a man who not only conquered the rocks, but understood their language, their secret script, engraved by millions of years of erosion and geologic change. In 1980, while climbing a new route on cave rock, which he later named Phantom Lord, Dan Osman experienced something that changed his perception of the extreme. While working over an overhanging ledge, he repeatedly fell off, dropping with a rope to a considerable height. These falls, whippers, as climbers call them, were frightening at first, but soon an amazing thing happened. Fear was replaced by excitement. At some point I realized that falling was a bigger challenge for me than the climbing itself, he later admitted in an interview with Rock and Ice. So, after coming face to face with his own fear of falling and learning to control that fear, Osman suddenly discovered a new realm of extreme climbing. the world of controlled freefall. By 1991, Dan was already experimenting with what would later be called rope-free flying, jumping with a rope with minimal stretch, providing a much longer free fall than in bungee jumping. His system was radically different from bungee jumping. Instead of an elastic cord, he used a dynamic nylon rope with a diameter of 10 or 11 millimeter, which stopped the fall abruptly, but not far from the ground. The story might have unfolded differently had it not been for a chance encounter at Cave Rock in the summer of 1991. Eric Perlman and Mike Hatchett, filmmakers making a documentary about rock climbing, noticed a lone figure climbing a 5.14 difficulty route, a rating available only to elite world-class climbers. Perlman sensed it immediately. The camera loves this man. One of the aspects that everyone knows but rarely articulates is that Dan was a brilliant performer. The camera loved him for his line and fluidity of movement, Perlman later recalled. So, Osmond became the star of the first Masters of Stone movie, which captured not only his climbing, but also his early experiments with jumping. The movie brought him fame far beyond his local community, and soon MTV was airing commercials featuring his falls, reaching an audience of millions. As his fame grew, so did the scale of his jumps. From an initial 300 feet, Osmond went to 600, then 800, installing increasingly complex systems. His engineering thinking manifested itself in inventive configurations of ropes, pulleys, and anchor points that experienced climbers called works of art. Unlike bungee jumpers working with commercial platforms, Osmond installed his systems in the most inaccessible places, on cliffs, bridges, and the arches of Utah's canyons. In doing so, he deliberately avoided duplicate belay systems, relying on a single rope and his own calculations, an approach that has drawn both admiration and criticism. The transition from rock climbing to rope-free flying wasn't just a change of discipline for Osmond. It was a logical extension of his inner journey, a constant search for new facets of extreme sports. "I'm genuinely scared. I'm doing this to learn how to overcome fear, to swim in it and go beyond it." These words reveal the true motivation of a man for whom risk was not just an adrenaline rush, but a profound experience of self-discovery. Behind the dizzying jumps and growing fame was another side of Dan Osmond's life. In the late 80s, he married, though the union was short-lived. His obsession with rock and increasingly risky projects ruined the marriage. Out of that brief union, however, came the most precious thing in his life, his daughter Emma. By the early 90s, when Dan had already separated from his wife, little Emma was living with her mother. He saw his daughter when he returned to Tahoe between trips, but the meetings were sporadic. The schedule of an itinerant rock climber rarely combined with the measured life of a child. "By dying, I'll let everyone down, my family, my friends. Emma will do fine, she'll be fine, but I'll deprive her of her father," Osmond confided to those close to him. You could hear the anxiety in his voice, but also the fatalism, as if he had already accepted the inevitability of choosing between passion and duty. "When I jump, I feel more alive than ever," he said in an interview. "But then I get home and I see Emma, and I realize I need to live to see her graduation, her wedding." By 1998, as Dan Osmond's name became legendary, and his jumps reached unprecedented heights, an internal conflict reached a tipping point. The paradox of his life was that his search for freedom through falling only kept him more firmly anchored to the ground, to his daughter, to his responsibilities, to the idea that his obsession had an exorbitant price. And the pendulum of his life continued to swing between safety and risk, between fatherhood and passion for flight, carrying him farther and farther to new heights, where the air grew thinner and the margin of safety thinner. Growing fame comes with a price. By the mid-1990s, after the release of several Masters of Stone movies featuring him, Dan Osmond's name was provoking polar reactions in the extreme sports community. To some, he was an icon, a rock climber pushing the boundaries of what was possible. to others, a reckless showman putting spectacle before safety. Dan did things we only dreamed of, recalled a young Alex Honnold, who watched tapes of his climbs in Sacramento as a child. At the same time, an older generation of climbers shook their heads. He's taking it too far. It's not climbing anymore, it's a circus. His jumps were of particular concern to national park rangers. After Osmond performed a series of impressive jumps from the Forest Hill Bridge more than 400 feet high in California, local authorities stepped up patrols of the site. "He's setting a dangerous example," one spokesperson said when video of the jump hit the local news. "Amateurs without his training will try to replicate it and die." Osmond's technically complex systems were admired by engineers. He calculated fall trajectories to within a few feet, using knowledge of physics and material properties gained through experience. But critics pointed to the most important thing: the lack of a redundant safety system. In the world of industrial climbing and even commercial bungee, this would be unthinkable. In traditional rock climbing, you have buddies, belays, hooks, a whole system. Dan had one rope and absolute faith in his calculations, commented Dave Griffith. That faith bordered on self-confidence, but it was the essence of his philosophy of risk. In April 1997, after a particularly dangerous arch jump in the Utah canyons, Osmond gave an interview to Outside Magazine in which he expressed his attitude to fear. "I'm really scared every time. Only fools or liars aren't scared. But I go into it precisely because of fear, to learn to live with it, to bathe in it, and go beyond it. When you really look fear in the eye, you begin to understand something about yourself and about life that you can't understand otherwise." By 1998, the external conflicts had only intensified. Yosemite, the holy of holies of American rock climbing, became Osmond's next target. The national park, with its strict rules and vigilant rangers, presented a double challenge, both as a landscape for record-breaking jumps and as an area where his activities were in a gray area of legality. For Dan, this was a new frontier, the last and most significant. October 1998. Yosemite Valley, protected by granite walls and thousand-year-old pines, looked especially impressive in the fall light. Here, between the legendary Leaning Tower Cliff and the little-known Fifi Buttress Cliff, Dan Osmond and his team were installing a system that would change the perception of what was possible in rope-free flying. A 200-foot-long horizontal line between 2 points allowed for a record-breaking jump of more than 1,000 feet of free fall. Installation took weeks. Every component of the system, from attachment points to nodes, was tested multiple times. Dan worked with precision accuracy, knowing that even millimeters can make a difference at this scale. Among his temporary jump partners was Dean Potter, a rising climbing star who would later set speed climbing records on El Capitan. Despite his own courage, Potter admitted that Osmond's jumps made him uncomfortable. "My climbing has always been about control, so throwing myself off cliffs thinking I might survive, I might die, made me a bit tense." On October 17, in the midst of preparing for the record-breaking jump, Dan's phone rang. It was his daughter, Emma, her voice shaking with tears. "Daddy, I'm scared for you," she said. Without a second's hesitation, Osmond put down his gear and got into the car. "This is more important," he said briefly to his surprised comrades. The rock could wait. His daughter could not. 2 days later, returning to Yosemite from a trip to see his family, Osmond faced an unforeseen twist of fate. He was arrested by rangers for unpaid parking tickets and other minor infractions. A situation that could have been resolved with a simple payment suddenly escalated. Dan was placed in solitary confinement for 12 days. The harsh confinement for a parking violator seemed excessive. Osmond's friends whispered about a demonstration lesson, a way for rangers to dissuade him from jumping in a national park. Either way, for a man accustomed to the freedom of the cliffs and open sky, the cell walls were an ordeal more severe than any physical challenge. 12 days later, When friends raised $25,000 bail, Dan was released. Eric Perlman, the Masters of Stone director who offered his house as collateral, met him in Reno. He was depressed after all that time alone, Perlman later recalled, watching Dan Osmond spend time with his daughter, trying to be a normal father despite the inner turmoil. During those November days in 1998, those close to him saw a change in Dan. He spoke of the last big jump, and that it's time to live a quieter life. In a rare interview, he admitted, "When this is all over, I'm looking forward to time with my daughter and family, and basically just laying on the couch for a while. I've been rushing around at cosmic speed for a long time, and I think everything has its time before it starts to catch up with you. I have this charismatic group of guardian angels who need a paid vacation." No one could have predicted that those words would prove prophetic, and that the guardian angels were indeed tired. "Two flat tires. Need to get back to the system in Yosemite to dismantle it," was the explanation Dan Osmond gave to his friend Miles Dasher, asking for a ride late in the evening of November 20th, 1998. After bail and a few days with his family in Reno, Osmond seemed resigned to the fact that his ambitious project would have to be scrapped. But something in his eyes said otherwise. They arrived in Yosemite on November 21 and climbed Leaning Tower that same evening. Osmond knew every stone of the route, even in the dark. The line between the tower and Fifi Buttress, strung a month ago, was still in place despite the rains and November snow. The system survived the weather, but the 925-foot rope he jumped from in October was inevitably exposed to the elements. On the morning of November 22, rather than begin dismantling, Osmond suggested, "Let's test the system first. I'll make the jump and then you." Miles, who trusted Dan's experience, agreed. The jumps were successful, and they spent the evening restocking the village store, talking about tomorrow, but never a word about dismantling the system. On November 23, 1998, at 4:15 p.m., Miles completed his jump and rappelled down the rope stored in his belt pouch. When he returned to the tower around 5:30 p.m., he found Osmond feverishly preparing for another jump. The sun was already slipping toward the horizon, plunging the valley into twilight. "I'll be jumping from a 1,000-foot line, which means I'll only be 150 feet off the ground when I stop," Osmond explained, adding an extra 75 feet of rope, which is 3 times the usual amount. He also changed the angle of the jump, requiring him to jump over the recovery line. Already in the encroaching darkness, he pulled out his phone to notify his friends of the upcoming record-breaking jump. Slipping the phone into the case on his chest, he prepared for the jump. The wind picked up, the cold air filled with anticipation. Looking back, Dasher saw the warning signs: the rush because of the darkness, the significant increase in rope, the change in angle, Osmond's confidence bordering on fear. But in that moment, faith in Dan's exceptional skill outweighed doubt. "It's not just about the ropes," Osmond said quietly before the jump, looking at the valley below. "It's about facing your fear. Falling is the most honest form of prayer." Dasher watched the flashlight on Dan's helmet disappear into the darkness. He heard the sound of a tightening rope beginning to whip, and then the sudden cessation of that sound. Osmond's shout. Then a heavy thump. In a panicked state, Dasher tried to reach him by radio, but there was no answer. As the silence dragged on, the worst fears turned into an unbearable certainty. Miles Dasher's heart was pounding like crazy as he made his way downstairs in the dark. Every second seemed like an eternity. When he reached the base, he turned on his headlamp and began to make his way across the rocky field, directing the beam of light between boulders and trees. At 1840, Dasher spotted a scrap of rope dangling from a branch high above the ground. Tracing his gaze downward, he saw Osmond lying on his side. In a last ray of hope, Dasher ran up and checked for a pulse. There was no pulse. Dan looked almost serene, as if he'd fallen asleep. No visible injuries, no grimace of pain, just the perfect piece of a man who was no longer fighting the Earth's gravity. At the age of 35, Dan Osmond made his last flight. Dasher, shaken to the core, rushed across the boulders to the nearest parking lot, where he struggled to dial his friend's number on a payphone. "Dan's dead," he said, sobbing. "He's on the ground. I just saw him. He's dead." A call to 911 followed. An hour later, the coroner arrived with park rangers who attempted to reach the scene, but turned back because of slippery conditions. The overnight rain had turned rocks into death traps. They contacted Dean Potter, then a member of Yosemite Search and Rescue, and asked him to find the body. Potter arrived late in the afternoon and spent the night next to his friend's body, guarding it from wild animals. In a strange irony of fate, Potter, who had been uncomfortable with Osmond's jumps, now found himself the final guardian of his rest, unaware that 17 years later he himself would die in a base jumping accident not far from here, from Taft Point in Yosemite. The next day, while inspecting the ropes, Potter and technical experts discovered a clue to the tragedy. Dan Osmond hadn't realized that changing the angle of the jump would put an excessive load on one of the knots connecting sections of his rope. That load, about 10-12 kilonewtons, equivalent to 2,700 pounds, exceeded the strength of the connection, causing the knot to slip. The technical miscalculation, compounded by a month of exposure to rain and snow on the gear, was fatal to a man who always claimed, "My life depends on the rope, so I know the rope better than anyone else." In a tragic irony, his last words to Dasher, all set," turned out to be the biggest mistake he ever made. The man who taught others to bathe in fear may not have experienced enough fear in that moment to stop. The imperceptible line between courage and recklessness, like the line between life and death, was crossed in the twilight November sky of Yosemite when the rope, instead of being a bridge between falling and flying, became a broken thread of fate. For 3 weeks after the tragedy, Osmond's system still hung between Leaning Tower and Fifi Buttress, including much of the broken jump line. Park rangers conducted an investigation that progressed more slowly than Dan's friends had anticipated. In December 1998, a rescue team retrieved the top sections of the jump line and sent them for examination. A company that makes world-class climbing equipment conducted a thorough analysis. The results were unequivocal. Osmond did not foresee that the change in jump angle would put undue stress on one of the knots. No deliberate sabotage was found. Rumors that the rangers may have damaged the rope as a lesson circulated in the climbing community, but laboratory analysis disproved this theory. The ropes were not significantly damaged by exposure to sun and rain in 3 weeks. Technically, the conclusion was simple. A key knot had slipped, not broken. On November 28, 1998, on a cold, windy day, more than 200 friends and family members gathered at Cave Rock above Lake Tahoe to pay their respects to Dan Osmond. His ashes were scattered over the waters of the lake he loved so much and where he spent the best years of his life. 8-year-old Emma, standing next to her mother, watched her father's ashes being carried away by the wind. Eric Perlman, Dave Griffith, Miles Dasher, and other close friends spoke words of farewell, of his courage, his talent, his humanity beyond the rocks and cameras. That same day, Osmond's friends announced a memorial fund for Emma. Recognizing that her father, despite his growing fame, had lived modestly and left no significant savings, the community decided to secure her future. The funds were earmarked for the education of a girl raised on stories of a dad who could fly. Dean Potter, who guarded Osmond's body the night after the tragedy, later said, "Dan lived life the way he thought was right, fully, intensely, accepting risk as part of the journey. We can argue about his choices, but not about his sincerity in following his vision." In Yosemite, where the final scene of his life played out, the memory of the man who danced with the abysses lingers among rangers and climbers. The park that arrested him became the site of his legend, a contradiction that Osmond would probably appreciate. Dan Osmond's death divided the world of extreme sports. Critics accused him of recklessness and irresponsibility to his daughter. Those who knew him personally saw a brave man who consciously faced his fears. He was not a madman risking his life for adrenaline, Eric Perlman noted in Outside Magazine. He was an explorer, an artist working in the medium of fear and gravity. What to others seemed reckless, to him was a deeply realized process. In 2007, the U.S. Forest Service permanently closed Cave Rock to rock climbing. There was something symbolic about the fact that the place Osmond transformed from a cluttered site to an iconic space for climbers remained his domain, untouched by new generations. Alex Honnold, who became famous for solo climbing El Capitan, recognized Osmond's influence. Dan Osmond did things on Cave Rock that, to me as a kid, represented the only sport routes I knew anything about. It was inspiring. Osmond's legacy in rope-free flying is more complex. His minimalist approach to safety didn't become mainstream. The cost of making a mistake was too high. But his philosophical attitude to fear has influenced modern aerial extreme sports. Dan Osmond's story reminds us that there is a fine line between triumph and tragedy. Extreme sports test the limits of human capabilities, but the dangers involved should never be underestimated. Perhaps Dan Osmond's greatest lesson is the importance of balance between passion and responsibility, between innovation and preparation, between freedom and caring for those who love us. As he himself said in his latest interview, "When this is all over, I really look forward to spending time with my daughter and family." For those who turn to the vertical worlds in search of themselves, his story serves as both inspiration and warning, as beautiful and merciless as the granite walls of Yosemite at dawn. Taiwan is an island of contrasts, known to most as an industrial giant, home to technology companies and bustling metropolises. But beyond the bustling cities lies a very different world. About 70% of this small island is covered by majestic mountain ranges, making Taiwan a true paradise for climbers and travelers. Located at the very edge of the Pacific Ring of Fire, Taiwan is formed by the continuous movement of tectonic plates. Earthquakes are commonplace here, leaving behind a bizarre landscape of sharp peaks, deep gorges, and steep slopes. More than 260 peaks exceed 10,000 feet above sea level, an impressive concentration for such a small island. The central mountain range stretches from north to south like its spine. Ancient trails blazed by Aboriginal peoples crisscross dense forests and alpine meadows. The historic Batongjan Trail, created by the natives and extended by the Japanese, today attracts adventurers with its wild beauty and complexity. The climate in Taiwan's mountains is unpredictable and dangerous. Summer typhoons bring torrential rains, and winter temperatures can dip below freezing, creating dangerous conditions for adventurers. Suddenly, descending fog reduces visibility to a few feet in a matter of minutes. Despite the dangers, thousands of tourists and professional mountaineers climb Taiwan's peaks every year. They come to see the sunrise from Yushan, Northeast Asia's highest mountain at 1,965 feet, or to explore unspoiled, timeless routes. In the age of social media, colorful photos of breathtaking views and intrepid summit climbers give the impression of accessibility and safety. What once seemed extreme becomes commonplace if you see it often enough on Instagram and Facebook. Such pictures make you forget about the real dangers and preparation behind every climb. But mountains don't forgive mistakes. They remain as dangerous as they were thousands of years ago, despite modern equipment and technology. Sometimes even experienced climbers face situations beyond their capabilities. It is here, among these majestic peaks and deep gorges, that the story of Gigi Wu unfolds, a woman whose passion for the mountains and unusual approach to mountaineering has made her one of the most talked about figures in the mountaineering community. Gigi Wu's office life at an international trading firm in Taipei changed dramatically in 2014 when the death of her father was a turning point in her destiny. Instead of sinking into a routine, the 31-year-old woman left a stable career and turned her eyes to the mountains, which became not just a hobby, but a way for her to heal. Her first ascents were tentative, like most beginners. With no formal training, she learned by experience. On Mount Yushan, Taiwan's highest peak, Gigi met Alex Yang, an experienced climber who would later become her close friend. But the real story of the bikini climber began by chance. After losing a friendly argument, Gigi made a promise to take a photo at the top of the next mountain in a bikini. What started as a joke turned into her signature style when she noticed the response these unusual photos were getting. The image of a fragile woman in a brightly colored swimsuit against the rugged mountain scenery created a striking contrast that drew attention. Quickly moving beyond mere fun, Gigi set an ambitious goal: to conquer 100 peaks in Taiwan, exceeding 9,800 feet. For any mountaineer, even one with years of experience, this was a major challenge, requiring not only physical fitness, but also in-depth knowledge of mountain terrain, weather conditions, and wilderness survival. By 2016, just 2 years after beginning her mountaineering journey, she had achieved her first significant goal of conquering all 100 peaks. This fact was surprising even to experienced climbers who had spent decades on such an accomplishment. Instead of stopping, Gigi set a new goal: to conquer all 268 mountains in Taiwan above 9,800 feet. By early 2019, she already had about 130 peaks under her belt. Behind the flamboyant image of the bikini mountaineer was a responsible traveler. She picked up trash on the trails and helped tired fellow travelers, even if it meant extra weight in her backpack. Despite her growing popularity, Gigi increasingly chose solo hikes, finding in them a special freedom and the opportunity to go at her own pace. But the mountains, as faithful teachers, more than once reminded her of their dangerous nature. In 2017, she narrowly escaped disaster on a solo hike, and in 2018 she shared on social media photos of scars from a fall that, in her words, nearly killed her. These warnings, however, didn't stop Gigi, but only strengthened her resolve to continue on her journey. By January 2019, 36-year-old Gigi Wu had become a symbol of how passion and perseverance can transform an ordinary office worker into an accomplished mountain conqueror. But there was a challenge ahead of her that would test the limits of her abilities and change her story forever. Behind Gigi Wu's bright social media pages was the challenging reality of a mountaineer. Each climb required meticulous preparation, physical endurance, and the ability to make quick decisions in critical situations. Her backpack, which weighed about 65 pounds, almost half her own weight, was a real challenge. Inside was everything she needed to survive, including a Canon 5D Mark III camera with lenses for her famous photos. Alex Young gave her a satellite phone, a device that was meant to be a lifeline in case of emergency. Professional climbers were critical of her approach. The heavy backpack increased the risk of losing her balance, and solo hikes left her unsupported in case of injury. But Gigi continued on her path, proving she could handle the challenges of the mountains alone. Twice, the mountains warned her of danger. After an incident in 2017 when she nearly got lost, Gigi wrote a prophetic phrase on social media: "A mistake made on a solo hike can be your last." And in 2018, after showing the scars on her legs from a serious fall, she admitted that she was on the cusp of death. But those situations didn't make her give up solo climbing. For Gigi, mountains were more than a hobby. They were her passion, her medicine, her way of life. Friends saw her change, growing stronger with each hike, finding freedom, challenge, and meaning in the mountains. In early 2019, a new goal was a route through Yushan National Park, which included the historic Batongan Trail and several unauthorized sections rarely visited even by experienced climbers. On January 11, 2019, Gigi Wu began what was planned as a 2-week journey. Her backpack loaded with everything she needed, she sent a message to friends with her itinerary, promising to contact them upon her return. The first few days of the hike passed without incident, but as she went deeper into the more remote and wilder areas of the park, communication became increasingly irregular. On January 19th, the 9th day of the hike, Gigi Wu reached a spot where a regular trail gave way to an unauthorized route. The weather, which was predicted to remain sunny, began to change rapidly. Fog was descending on the slopes, visibility was decreasing, and the first drops of rain heralded bad weather. Standing at the crossroads between a safe return and the uncharted road ahead, Gigi made the choice that would determine her fate. She continued toward Mount Jupen, where the biggest challenge of her life awaited her. On January 19, 2019, the sky above Mount Jupen was gradually covered with clouds. What started as a minor weather deterioration quickly turned into a serious threat. Visibility was decreasing by the hour, and the trail was becoming dangerously slippery in the increasing rain. Gigi Wu advanced down the mountainside with the caution of an experienced mountaineer. Under the weight of her backpack, each step required concentration. She was at about 7,800 feet above sea level, in a section where the official trail had long since been left behind. Here, on an ancient path laid out by the Kalabuan natives, nature ruled undivided. The trail narrowed, winding between boulders and trees, clinging by their roots to the steep slope. A narrow gorge could be seen a few dozen meters below. Normally, an experienced climber would have had little difficulty on this section, but today everything was against her. The weather, the weight of her gear, the fatigue of 9 days of travel. The moment that changed everything came suddenly. Whether it was a slippery rock, a wrong step, or an accidental loss of balance, the exact cause was unknown. In an instant, Gigi Wu felt the ground slipping away from under her feet and the heavy backpack pulling her down the slope. The fall was swift and unstoppable. After flying about 100 feet, she landed on a narrow rock ledge, the only thing separating her from falling into a deep gorge with little chance of survival. The shock of the impact was quickly replaced by the realization of the situation. She couldn't move her legs. A sharp pain pierced her lower body, signaling serious injury. The backpack fell nearby, a happy accident that offered a ghostly chance of salvation. Gigi, overcome with pain, reached for the satellite phone, the only connection to the outside world in this remote area with no cellular coverage. At 4:30 p.m. that afternoon, Alex Young's phone rang in Taipei. Calls from Gigi during camping trips were common, but she usually got in touch in the evening when she had already set up camp. Calling too early alerted him. Gigi's voice, punctuated by static, sounded strained. In 30 short seconds, she was able to say the most important thing. She had fallen into a ravine on the side of Mount Jupen, unable to move and in desperate need of help. The connection broke as suddenly as it had begun, leaving Alex with the coordinates of her location and growing anxiety. Without delay, he contacted the authorities, relaying all available information to the Nantou County Fire Department, in charge of rescue operations in Yushan National Park. The coordinates were accurate. The northwest slope of Juping Mountain, at about 4,900 feet above sea level. But even with this data, the rescue did not promise to be easy. While Alex did his best in Taipei, trying again and again to reach Gigi, she was alone on a narrow ledge of rock. The rain was getting heavier, and the temperature began to drop as evening fell. With each passing hour, her situation grew more desperate. The fog descended, enveloping the mountainside in a dense veil, and then came darkness. Not the city twilight with the soft light of street lamps, but the absolute, impenetrable darkness of the wilderness. Gigi, unable to move, could only wait, hoping that rescue would come before the cold and injuries took their toll. That night on the slope of Mount Jupen, the temperature plunged to 35.6 degrees Fahrenheit. For a person immobilized and wet from the rain, with no way to build a fire or take shelter in a tent, such conditions are deadly. Hypothermia, the gradual cooling of the body, begins to develop imperceptibly but inexorably. As Gigi struggled for life on the mountainside, the rescue operation faced its first obstacles. 3 attempts to get Black Hawk helicopters in the air were canceled due to dangerous weather conditions. Thick fog made flying in the mountainous terrain impossible. The situation was becoming critical. The hours were ticking by, and the help Gigi Wu had so hoped for was still far away. In loneliness, cold, and darkness, the longest night of her life began. A night that would test the limits of human endurance and make her wonder, what happens to a person when all that remains is one hope? The dawn of January 20th brought not relief, but a new wave of anxiety. The fog on the slopes of Mount Jupen had not cleared, and the rain continued with the same vigor. The temperature remained low, only 37 degrees Fahrenheit. In such conditions, even professional rescuers realized that time was working against them. The Nantou County Fire Department took over the coordination of the rescue operation. Taiwan's National Air Rescue Corps tried again to raise the Black Hawk helicopters, but without success. It became clear the only way to reach Gigi Wu was on foot. Such a difficult mission required not just rescuers, but people who knew the area like the back of their hand. They chose the Kalibuang people, the indigenous mountain people of Taiwan, whose ancestors had lived there for centuries. 2 experienced guides from the Kalibuang tribe and a professional firefighter formed the first search party. In the early morning hours, a blue pickup truck slowly climbed the winding mountain roads, taking the rescuers higher and higher into the mountains. They had reached 7,900 feet, the highest elevation the vehicle could reach. The next step was to walk, carrying about 45 pounds of rescue equipment: ropes, stretchers, medical supplies, food and water. A second team of rescuers moved in behind, ready to support the first group. Their job was to establish additional communication points and ensure the victim could be evacuated if she could be found. The rescuers' path took them along rain-washed paths, through slippery slopes and dense undergrowth. Every step required extreme caution. One mistake could turn the rescuers into casualties. But the Kalibuang representatives confidently led the group, using knowledge passed down from generation to generation. Guided by the coordinates received from Gigi's satellite phone, the rescuers moved toward the northwest slope of Mount Jupen. With each passing hour, they were getting closer to the suspected crash site, but conditions were only getting worse. The fog grew thicker, making the search a real challenge. By late afternoon, the first group of rescuers had reached an altitude of about 5,150 feet, almost near where the call had been made. But the advancing darkness and dangerous terrain forced them to stop and set up camp. A cold night spent in tents under incessant rain was a test even for the mountain-hardened Kalibuans. During this time in Taipei, Alex Yang was having trouble finding a place to stay. After a single call to Gigi, his connection with her was cut off. He continued to call her satellite phone every hour, but heard only silence in response. He kept in touch with the rescue team, but their messages were not comforting. The weather was not improving and the search was dragging on. The morning of January 21st finally brought some improvement in the weather. The fog cleared in some places and visibility improved. The rescuers resumed their search with renewed vigor, methodically searching every meter of the rocky slope. Around noon, one of the Kalibuang guides noticed something at the bottom of the slope, a small rock ledge where something bright was visible. As the rescuers approached, they saw a human figure in a backpack. It was Gigi. She was lying on her back, covered by a silver aluminum thermal blanket. Nearby were her belongings: a satellite phone, a flashlight strapped to her wrist, and a jacket that strangely wasn't on her, but lying next to her. The rescuers called out to her, but there was no response. Descending to the narrow ledge where Gigi was located required mountaineering skills. The rescuers secured ropes and began a cautious descent. When they reached her, it was clear that help had come too late. Gigi Wu was not breathing, and her skin was cold to the touch. Doctors would later determine hypothermia as the likely cause of death. The long hours of immobility in the cold, compounded by the trauma of the fall, was a fatal combination. Rescuers carefully transferred the body to a stretcher and began the arduous climb up the slope. Only in the evening, when the fog cleared, was it possible to call a helicopter for evacuation. Gigi Wu was leaving her beloved mountains for the last time, not as a victorious woman with a photo at the top, but as a reminder of that fine line that separates courage from recklessness. News of the death of the bikini climber quickly traveled around Taiwan and then the world. The story of a woman who climbed more than 130 peaks, only to die on the 181st, touched the hearts of many, prompting reflection on the nature of risk, fame, and the true cost of our passions. News of Gigi Wu's death spread lightning fast. Her Facebook page, which had recently been filled with vivid photos from the mountain peaks, became a memorial. Thousands of followers left comments ranging from words of grief and gratitude to harsh assessments of her choice to take risks on a solo trek. Public reaction was predictably mixed. For many, Gigi became a symbol of female strength and courage, proof that mountains are conquered not by gender, but by spirit and determination. She was a mountain goddess, her fans wrote, admiring not only her looks, but also her inner strength, which allowed an office worker to transform into an experienced mountaineer. But other voices emerged. Critics saw Gigi's tragedy as a natural outcome of the pursuit of likes, accusing her of irresponsibility and vanity. She risked her life for spectacular photos, they argued, often without even knowing her actual accomplishments and contributions to the climbing community. Inaccurate headlines in the Western media like "Taiwanese glamorous bikini climber dies" only fueled this view. The truth, as is often the case, was somewhere in the middle. Those who really knew Gigi realized that her bikini photos were only a small part of the stories she shared. Behind the striking shots were years of preparation, hundreds of miles of trails traveled, and a genuine love for the mountains of Taiwan. The tragedy took an unexpected turn when the Taiwanese authorities decided to punish the family of the deceased. Gigi Wu's mother was fined $60,000 for the cost of the rescue operation. The basis was the fact that the climber's body was on an unauthorized trail without official permission. This approach sparked outrage in the climbing community. Gigi's friends, many of whom were experienced climbers, protested. They recalled her contribution to the promotion of Taiwan's mountains, her assistance to novice travelers through detailed descriptions of routes, and how she herself had repeatedly helped tired fellow travelers. Under public pressure, the authorities eventually lifted the fine, recognizing the unfairness of such a punishment for the bereaved family. Gigi Wu's funeral was held in New Taipei. The ashes were placed in a small box and buried in the city cemetery under a simple stone. But the farewell ceremony drew climbers from all over Taiwan, from Taipei, Kaohsiung, Hualien. People who knew her personally and those who followed her travels on social media came to pay their respects to a woman whose passion for the mountains cut short her life but inspired many. Gigi Wu's death was included in the sad statistics. Research shows that from 2011 to 2017, there were more than 250 deaths worldwide related to the creation of extreme selfies. Falls from heights account for half of those cases. Although Gigi herself was not taking selfies at the time of her fall, her story has become part of a global discussion about the impact of social media on risk perception. What would have happened if the mountain trail had remained just a trail and not a potential backdrop for a spectacular shot? Would people's perceptions of danger change if they saw not only triumphant moments at the summits, but also cold nights in tents, grueling climbs, bloody blisters, and the real risks of mountain hiking? Gigi Wu did not seek death, but accepted risk as part of her journey. Her story is not just a chronicle of tragedy, but an occasion to reflect on how modern society views danger, courage, and their consequences. Now her name is spoken with respect in Taiwan's mountaineering circles. Her roots and advice continue to help travelers, and her passion for the mountains resonates with a new generation of climbers who see her as an example that women can climb as well as men. But the main lesson of her story is not about climbing techniques or spectacular photographs. It is that mountains, for all their beauty, remain deadly for those who lose their guard or overestimate their strength. And even the most experienced mountaineer can find himself defenseless in the face of the elements if he has to face it alone. Gigi Wu went into the mountains on January 11, 2019 and never returned. But her spirit continues to live there, among the peaks of Taiwan, as a reminder of the fine line between courage and recklessness, between passion and obsession, between life and death. Taiwan's mountains remain as beautiful and dangerous as Gigi Wu knew them to be. Every day, new travelers climb the trail she once described in her posts. Many of them have heard her story, the tale of a woman whose life has come to symbolize both the opportunities and the dangers of modern mountaineering. Gigi Wu's story makes us think about how our relationship with risk has changed in the digital age. When majestic peaks and dangerous routes become just a backdrop for the perfect Instagram shot, the line between true adventure and the pursuit of virtual recognition blurs. The irony is that Gigi, despite her bikini mountaineer image, was the real deal, someone for whom the mountains meant much more than just an opportunity to snap a spectacular photo. Her detailed descriptions of her routes, the trash she picked up on the trails, the help she gave to fellow travelers, all of this speaks to a deep respect for nature that often escapes the attention of those who have only seen her flashy swimsuit shots. Since her death, there has been a subtle but important change in Taiwan's climbing community. Experienced travelers began to talk more about the importance of pair climbing and full emergency gear. Some clubs introduced additional mountain survival and first aid training. The GI tragedy did not lead to bans or strict restrictions. Rather, it was a catalyst for a more informed approach to risk. That said, social media continues to create a distorted view of mountain hiking. For every post about real dangers, there are dozens of triumphant selfies at the summits, creating the illusion of accessibility and safety. Beginners, inspired by such images, sometimes set off on challenging routes without the necessary training, equipment, or knowledge. Gigi Wu wasn't just a victim of social media. She was an experienced climber who took informed risks. But even her experience over 130 peaks could not protect her from a fatal combination of circumstances: falling, injury, cold, and loneliness. Perhaps the main lesson of her story is that nature makes no exceptions. Neither experience, nor fame, nor perfect social media shots can guarantee safety in the wilderness. Mountains don't get any friendlier just because we've seen them thousands of times in beautiful photos. Now that the topic of extreme selfies and deaths for the sake of spectacular shots is regularly in the news, Gigi's story is a reminder. Behind every such tragedy is a real person with their own hopes, fears, and dreams, not just a statistic or a cautionary tale. Ultimately, everyone who ventures into the mountains is forced to find their own balance between courage and caution, between striving for achievement and respecting their own boundaries. Where is the line between bravery and recklessness? This question remains open, and the answer is different for everyone. Gigi Wu found freedom, healing, and ultimately, destiny in the mountains. Her story, like the trail she traveled, lives on, a reminder of the beauty and ruthlessness of the world around us, of the fine line between triumph and tragedy, and of the fact that even in the age of instant messaging and global connectivity, we can still find ourselves completely alone, one-on-one with a wilderness that does not forgive mistakes. Glaciers hold centuries-old secrets imprinted in layers of ancient ice, but they also have another side. They collect their tribute from those who dare to challenge them. Ted Porter's story is the tale of a man who paid that tribute and, against all odds, came back to tell it. Glacier National Park is a majestic natural monument spread out in northwestern Montana on the Canadian border. More than 1 million acres of pristine terrain, where high mountain peaks neighbor crystal-clear lakes and ancient forests, give way to the ice fields that gave the park its name. The creation of the park in May 1910 recognized its unique natural value, which still attracts thousands of tourists each year. Jackson Glacier is one of the most impressive and dangerous glaciers in the system. Located on the northwest slope of Mount Jackson, This relatively small glacier had a footprint of only 2 square miles in 2013, a tiny shard of what covered these mountains a century ago. Its steep slopes, with gradients of 20 to 40 degrees, pose serious hazards even for experienced climbers. Under a thin layer of snow, there were numerous cracks up to several dozen feet deep, ready to swallow a careless traveler. On this day, the weather added an extra dimension of danger. The sky over Glacier was overcast with low clouds, with occasional showers of rain. Water was turning the glacier surface into a deadly slippery slope, and visibility was getting worse by the hour. Temperatures hovered around 50 degrees, warm enough to cause melting, yet cold enough that a soaked person would quickly begin to freeze. In this deceptively beautiful setting of September 2013, where ice fields meet the sky and silence is broken only by the whisper of wind and the crackling of ancient ice, one rash move set off a chain of events that turned an ordinary hike into a desperate struggle for every next breath. Ted Porter, a 36-year-old voice actor from Los Angeles, was no casual hiker in Glacier National Park. His relationship with these mountains goes back to his earliest childhood, when his parents first brought him here as an infant. Since then, the park has been an integral part of his life, a place where his character, values, and love of nature were formed. Ted's connection to Glacier wasn't just emotional, it was almost familial. He worked at the Mini Glacier Hotel in his youth, then attended the University of Montana. For a kid from Kansas City who grew up among the plains, Montana's mountains became a second home, where every trail, every river bend, and every pass was familiar to the smallest detail. "I know Glacier like my own backyard," Ted often told friends, and there was no exaggeration in that. Tall, with an athletic build and a confident gaze, Ted exuded the quiet confidence of a man accustomed to relying on himself. His knowledge of mountain survival was not superficial. Years of hiking had taught him how to read the weather, find trails, and deal with the unexpected. Perhaps it was this confidence that was his weakness, the line that thinly separates experience from complacency. Family camping trips to Glacier were a sacred tradition for the Porters. Every summer or every other year, they would come here, camp by one of the many lakes, and explore the park. Ted's father, who once worked at the same Mini Glacier Hotel, passed on to his son not only a love of these places, but also a respect for their unpredictable character. Over the years, however, Ted began to crave the more challenging trails, the corners of the park where ordinary hikers didn't wander. In September 2013, after a week spent with his parents on relatively easy trails, Ted felt the familiar call of the mountains. His parents flew back to Kansas City, and he decided to stay a few days to fulfill a longtime dream of climbing Mount Jackson and hiking its famous glacier. It was a route he had heard and read about, but had never dared to take in the company of his family. The morning of September 2, 2013, greeted Glacier with low clouds and drizzling rain. Ted Porter woke up in his hotel room near the park, looked out the window at the gray sky, and for a moment hesitated in his plans. The weather wasn't ideal for climbing, but it wasn't bad enough to cancel the hike. After all, that's what he'd come here for, to conquer Jackson Glacier. Methodically packing his backpack, Ted went by the mental checklist of a seasoned hiker. A fleece jacket and raincoat, gloves, hat, spare socks, anything to stay warm and dry, a gallon of water and a couple of energy bars, enough for a day hike, flashlight, map, compass, bear spray, for safety, and of course, an ice axe and crampons, essential glacier gear. Light kit for a day hike, he muttered to himself as he tightened the straps of his backpack. The backpack was compact, but contained everything he needed for the planned route. Ted left early, and by 11 a.m. he was on the trail. The rain continued to drizzle, turning the ground into slippery mud. The trail to Jackson Glacier started at Going to the Sun Road and first led through the woods to Gunsight Lake. Ted walked quickly, enjoying the solitude and silence. After spending a week with his parents, he appreciated being alone with nature. moving at his own pace, stopping only where he wanted to. "I felt fantastic and was in good shape," he later recalled. Despite the late start and the rain, Ted was hurrying, making up time. The forest around him grew thinner, revealing views of majestic mountain peaks framed by low clouds. After 2 hours of fast walking, Ted reached Gunsight Lake and the turnoff to the trailhead for Jackson Glacier. He stopped, checking the map. The signpost at the turn was barely visible, a faded wooden post that could easily have been missed. The trail went upward, winding between rocks and sparse shrubs. Here it was no longer as well marked as the main hiking route. The last miles to the glacier became a real challenge. The trail became an eroded, muddy lane, disappearing among the rocks in places. Ted noticed fresh bear scat, a reminder that he wasn't the only inhabitant here. He checked to see if he could easily get bear spray out of his backpack's side pocket and moved on. Suddenly, rounding a rocky ledge, Ted encountered a group of hikers descending. In this wilderness, where he hadn't expected to meet anyone, the appearance of people came as a surprise. "Be careful," warned one of them, a man in a red jacket. "It's very slippery up there. It's just been raining." Ted nodded, grateful for the warning, but inwardly brushed off the advice. He was young, confident in his abilities, and knew these places well. In the back of his mind, he even thought that these hikers were probably just not experienced enough for the challenging conditions. This was the first of a chain of mistakes that would soon put his life in jeopardy. As he continued to climb, Ted didn't realize that the warning was not just a polite tourist exchange of information, but critical advice that he had ignored due to his own complacency. Soon, Ted found himself halfway up the north side of Mount Jackson. The trail disappeared, and he climbed steep scree until he finally reached the foot of the glacier. The view was breathtaking. The Jackson Glacier spread out before him, covering the north slope of the mountain. The snowy surface resembled a frozen sea going toward the summit, which towered another 3,000 feet above him. The sun peeked out briefly, making the glacier glisten, but Ted's experienced eye recognized more than beauty. It noted faults that could be deep crevasses. Putting on his crampons, Ted began his ascent up the glacier. Halfway up, he noticed a rocky ridge and decided to change his route. It was about 2 o'clock in the afternoon. He had to be back before dark. However, the weather was rapidly deteriorating. The rain made the rocks slippery, and at one point Ted almost fell off, only to miraculously regain his balance. His heart was pounding with adrenaline. That moment was the signal that further climbing was becoming too dangerous. "I've got to go back," he decided as he took one last look at the peak, hidden in the clouds. Ted evaluated 2 possible ways to descend: back up the slippery rocks or down the glacier at its steepest point. After deliberation, he chose the glacier. It seemed faster, and despite the steepness, Ted was confident in his abilities. He looked down the slope below him. The slope started gently, then became steeper, but the snow looked deep enough. There were crampons in his backpack, but setting them up would take time. The clouds were thickening, and there was less and less daylight. "I've done this before," Ted thought. "I'll just go down faster." That thought was a turning point, a change from a normal hike to a fight for survival in one of the most dangerous places in Glacier National Park. Ted decided to leave the cats in his backpack. He cast one last glance at the glacier slope below. The gradient seemed manageable, gentle at first, then getting steeper, but the layer of snow looked thick enough to provide good traction. He checked his backpack straps, tightened his bootlaces, and clutching his trekking poles in his hands, stepped onto the glacier. The disaster was instantaneous. Beneath the thin layer of snow was ice as hard as stone. Ted's feet lost their footing, and he fell on his back. The next second, his body was an uncontrollable sled sliding down the icy slope. Panic came in waves. Ted tried desperately to slow his descent by thrusting his sticks into the glacier surface, but their tips slid powerlessly across the ice. With each passing second, he picked up speed, turning what had begun as a controlled descent into a relentless tumble. Ted tried to dig his boot heels into the ice, clinging to the frozen slope with his bare hands, all to no avail. Cold splashes of ice and snow slammed into his face, temporarily blinding him. Through the moisture in his eyes, he tried to see where his inertia was carrying him. Ahead, right in the path of his uncontrolled slide, was a gaping crack in the glacier. Wide and dark, it seemed to open its jaws, ready to swallow him. Ted had no chance to change the trajectory of his movement. He was doomed to fly straight into the rift. The world around him was moving at a dizzying speed, but Ted's perception was strangely slowed. His thoughts became crystal clear. My God, I'm going to die. In a last desperate impulse, Ted decided to try to jump over the crack. If he pushed off the ice with his feet at the very edge of the rift, he might be able to fly over the abyss. He waited until the last possible moment, then pushed off with all the strength he could muster. The jump failed. Instead of flying over the crack, Ted crashed violently into its front wall. The last thing he felt was the moment he fell deep into the icy chasm. Consciousness returned to Ted slowly. First came the sensation of cold, penetrating to the bone, then the realization that he was lying on something hard and wet. Finally, he dared to open his eyes. Darkness enveloped him. Only a thin strip of light from above made it possible to distinguish the outline of the cleft. Ted was lying on a rock ledge at the bottom of the crevasse, about 30 feet from the surface of the glacier. His backpack was still on him, probably to cushion the impact of the fall. Ted tried to assess his position. All around him were smooth walls of ice rising upward toward a distant clearing in the sky. He tried to move, and at that moment a piercing pain shot up his back. The pain was so intense that for a moment white spots flashed before his eyes. When the first wave of agony receded, Ted did what he had been afraid to do. He tried to move his legs. Nothing. Not the slightest movement. Panic struck with renewed force when he realized he couldn't feel anything below his waist. The impact had probably damaged his spine, and now he couldn't move. Ted looked up at the narrow strip of sky, so distant and unreachable. The temperature in the crevasse was much lower than on the surface, no more than a few degrees above zero. The cold was already creeping under his clothes, making his teeth chatter involuntarily. In desperation, Ted fumbled for his cell phone in his pocket. With trembling fingers, he unlocked the screen, but hope faded as soon as he saw the absence of a network signal. No one knew where he was. It was getting colder by the minute, and Ted realized that even if he survived the trauma, the cold would kill him in a matter of hours. In this moment of utter hopelessness, Ted opened the camera app. If he was destined to die here, he wanted to leave one last message to his parents. With a trembling hand, he turned on the recording, and through the coming tears, he spoke. I fell into a crevasse. My back hurts a lot. I'm still alive. Still alive. If I don't get out, I love you. I'm not kidding. This is not a joke. Ted finished the tape. For a minute, he just lay there, resigned to the thought of the end. But then something changed. First, he felt a slight tingling in his legs, then a dull ache. Slowly but surely, sensation returned to his lower body. Suddenly, all thoughts of death receded. A fierce determination to survive flared up inside. Ted didn't want to die in that icy grave. He didn't want the rescuers to find his stiffened body. If there was still the slightest chance of getting out, he had to take it. With great effort, Ted took off his backpack and pulled out a fleece jacket. He pulled it on over his already wet clothes, then pulled out his crampons and ice axe, the last tools he had to lean on. There was no choice. There was only one way up. The pain in his back was tearing, but since he could feel his legs, there was still hope. Slowly, overcoming the pain, Ted rolled over and tried to stand up. He leaned on his ice axe and straightened up as far as his injury would allow. Every movement resonated with a flash of agony, but he forced himself to move, searching the walls of the crevasse for a way out. And then came the terrible realization. He was not at the bottom, but on a ledge. Below was a gaping blackness, another abyss. One step to the side, and it could have ended differently. He looked at the walls. One was steep and overhanging, impossible to climb. The other was steep, but at an angle of about 40 degrees, and there were bumps to grab onto. When he reached it, he put on his crampons, drove his teeth into the ice, then hammered his ice axe above his head. The metal rattled into the hard surface. Climbing seemed insane. No insurance, no second ice axe, no experience in ice climbing, and most importantly, a damaged spine where any movement could be the last. But to stay meant one thing: to freeze. So Ted began the ascent, inch by inch, digging into the crampons, pulling himself up on the ice axe, clinging to barely visible bumps with his frozen fingers. The strategy was extremely simple. Lift himself a few inches each time, then rest with his face and body pressed against the icy wall. Several times Ted was on the verge of a breakdown. The crampons slipped. The ice axe failed to find a reliable footing. At such times, only the instinct of self-preservation and a desperate desire to live kept him going. Minute by minute, inch by inch, Ted climbed toward the light. The icy wall, which from below seemed insurmountable, gradually gave way under his persistence. Finally, after what seemed like an eternity, Ted's ice axe dug into the edge of the crack. With a last, desperate effort, he pulled himself up and over the edge, climbing out of the ice trap. Ted lay on his stomach, sprawled on the surface of the glacier. His body was shaking uncontrollably, partly from the cold, partly from adrenaline and exhaustion. Nearby gaped the black maw of the crevasse that had nearly become his grave. Now that Ted was on the surface, the temperature seemed almost warm compared to the icy cold of the crack, but he couldn't afford to rest. Thanks to his perseverance, he had spent no more than 40 minutes in the crevasse, but it was enough to put him on the verge of hypothermia. Ted realized with horror that he was lying on a narrow snow bridge between the crevasse he had just climbed out of and another crevasse right next to it. One careless shift of weight and he could fall again. Gritting his teeth, Ted began to crawl slowly, advancing like a caterpillar, using his ice axe as an anchor. Gathering the last of his strength, Ted pushed himself off the snow and struggled to his feet. Leaning heavily on the ice axe, he began a slow, agonizing descent down the glacier. When he finally reached the bottom of the glacier, he realized that his ordeal was just beginning. He now had to hike 3 miles through rocky terrain to Gansite Lake, where he hoped to find people. The trail he had climbed briskly in the morning now became an agonizing obstacle course. It narrowed, became slippery from the rain, looped between boulders. At one point, Ted lost his balance and collapsed to the ground, writhing in unbearable pain. After lying there for a few minutes, he remembered the danger of falling prey to a predator. In the morning, he had seen fresh bear tracks. With inhuman effort, Ted forced himself up. Now he moved with extreme caution, holding an ice axe in one hand and a can of bear spray in the other. By 5 o'clock in the evening, Ted finally emerged from the woods into the open meadow surrounding Gansite Lake. He prayed there were people here. Rounding the last bend in the trail, Ted saw them 2 hikers sitting on a large boulder at the water's edge. Gathering the rest of his strength, he headed toward them. Noticing his uncertain, stumbling gait, the hikers stood up. "Are you okay?" one of them asked, looking anxiously at Ted's pale, haggard face. "I fell into a crevasse on the Jackson Glacier," answered Ted, and these simple words, spoken with difficulty, opened the way to his salvation. A group of hikers quickly gathered around Ted. The disbelief in their eyes was replaced by anxiety as they realized the seriousness of the situation. Among them were people with a basic knowledge of first aid. They gently laid Ted on an air mattress, wrapped him in sleeping bags, and pulled dry socks over his frozen feet. A woman named Janet took over Ted's care, urging him to remain still as they could not determine the severity of his injury. Someone handed him paracetamol tablets and a bottle of water. Despite the throbbing pain in his back with every breath, the sense of human presence brought a strange calmness. For the first time in this endless day, Ted allowed himself to close his eyes. Dusk was rapidly thickening, and the hikers were discussing a plan of action. Disagreements arose. Some suggested going immediately for help, while others pointed out the dangers of traveling through bear territory at night. When the hikers turned to Ted for advice, he, feeling a little better in a stationary position and not realizing the severity of his injuries, suggested waiting until morning. The thought of ruining someone else's hike depressed him as much as the physical pain. The group decided that 2 of the hikers would go to the rangers at dawn, and the others would stay with Ted to keep him warm and monitor his condition. As darkness fell, the campers dispersed to their tents. Ted's back had completely stiffened by then, making it impossible for him to make even the slightest movement without excruciating pain. He spent the night under the open sky, looking up at the stars and fighting the feeling that time had stopped. Checking his watch became an agonizing ritual. What seemed like an hour or 2 actually turned out to be measly minutes. The only consolation was the presence of Janet, who periodically checked on his condition, adjusted his sleeping bags, and simply held his hand, distracting him with conversation. There was a human warmth in her voice and gestures that Ted would never forget. The first bird trills and the faint glow of dawn brought relief. The camp began to move. 2 campers went off as planned to find help, and Janet remained seated next to Ted, continuing to distract him from the growing pain with talk of everyday things. Around 10 in the morning, the distinctive sound of helicopter blades was heard in the distance. The hikers who had left to get help met a ranger at the foot of the trail, who immediately called for an air ambulance. Moments later, 2 paramedics in bright red jackets were at Ted's side. After a brief examination, they administered synthetic morphine for pain relief and, with the help of the hikers, carefully moved him onto a stretcher. Over the radio, the medics reported a suspected serious spinal injury and the need for immediate evacuation. Ted had time to cast one last look at the hikers who had saved him, especially at Janet. Words of gratitude stuck in his dry throat, but she seemed to understand him without words. The stretcher was lifted and the rescuers carried Ted to the waiting helicopter. He was loaded, strapped in, and the machine lifted off the ground, gaining altitude over the majestic expanse of Glacier National Park. The flight to Kalispell Regional Medical Center took about half an hour. The medics stayed by Ted's side the entire time, monitoring his condition and keeping him talking so he wouldn't pass out. He noted that Ted was incredibly lucky, as many people don't make it out of situations like this. The helicopter landed on the hospital grounds, where a medical team was already waiting for Ted. He was quickly moved to the emergency room for initial tests and x-rays. In the emergency room, doctors performed a series of tests. The results showed that Ted had suffered a severe tear fracture of his L2 vertebrae, caused by a severe impact from the fall. Of particular concern was a bone fragment that was only 2 millimeters from the spinal cord and threatened complete paralysis. Ted had time to talk briefly with his parents on the phone, but the conversation was interrupted when the doctors announced the need for emergency surgery. The anesthesiologist was already preparing him for transfer to the operating room, explaining that the bone fragment was pressing on the spinal cord like a spear point, and if it penetrated the spinal cord sheath, partial or complete paralysis was possible. After waking up from surgery, Ted learned that the intervention had gone according to plan. The surgeons placed 2 rods and 8 screws to secure the spine, fusing 3 vertebrae together to provide stability. The days that followed merged for Ted into a hazy succession of painkillers, doctor's visits, and brief conversations with concerned parents. After a few days of immobile recovery, the rehabilitation program began. Time was a critical factor in regaining mobility. The medical staff helped Ted relearn walking by supporting muscle memory. After a week, he was discharged from the hospital and flew to his parents' home to continue his recovery. Despite the successful surgery and physical therapy, Ted had to accept a new reality. His life had changed forever. A spinal fracture was not the kind of injury that could be reversed without consequences. In the months and years that followed, Ted devoted himself to various methods of recovery, physical therapy, acupuncture, yoga, meditation. He tried both medication and holistic approaches. Against all odds, he refused to let trauma define the boundaries of his life. Constant pain complicated the ability to enjoy life as before, but that didn't stop Ted from returning to activity. He went to the gym regularly, planned new, safer routes, and treasured each moment with renewed intensity. His story became an example of what can be achieved even after the most serious injury. The nightmares in which Ted fell into an endless ice crevasse over and over again became less frequent over time. He learned to get out, if not from the crack itself, then from the shadow it cast on his life. 5 years later, standing at the foot of Jackson Glacier, Ted felt a familiar throbbing in his back, an ever-present reminder of that day. But now it was also a symbol of his victory over fear, over the elements, over his own limitations. Not everything in life is under human control, but you can always choose to face what fate sends. For all its beauty and majesty, wildlife can be a ruthless teacher. Yosemite National Park, nestled in the heart of California, embodies this truth like no other place. Here, amid ancient sequoias and mighty waterfalls, nature has created one of the most spectacular landscapes on Earth. Granite monoliths rise above the valley like silent guardians, preserving millions of years of geologic history. Half Dome is the king of these stone giants. Rising nearly 5,000 feet above Yosemite Valley, this mountain with its distinctive cut top has become not just a natural landmark, but a true symbol of the American wilderness. To the native Miwok people, the mountain was known as Tisa-Ak, a place where nature speaks to people through thunder and lightning. The journey to the top of Half Dome is a 16-mile challenge that requires hikers to not only be physically fit, but to respect the forces of nature. The route begins in the valley at the Happy Isles Bridge, climbs through Vernal and Nevada Falls, and passes through the quiet little Yosemite Valley before leading to the final challenge, the famous cables. This final section of the climb, 400 feet of nearly vertical granite, features parallel steel cables and wooden rungs installed back in 1919. Summer thunderstorms are not uncommon here. In July and August, warm mountain air regularly spawns sudden storms, turning the majestic peak into a deadly hazard. Half Dome's smooth granite becomes an ideal conductor for lightning, and its height makes it a natural lightning rod. The National Park Service records several lightning incidents each year, reminding visitors of the unpredictable power of nature. In 1985, the park's thunderstorm warning system was minimal. Tourists relied on their own observations and experience, often underestimating the pace of changing weather conditions in the mountains. And it was here, on this legendary peak, that one summer day a group of hikers encountered a force of nature that changed their lives forever. On that July morning in 1985, 9 people began their ascent of Half Dome. Leading the group were 28-year-old Tom Rice and 24-year-old Adrian Esteban, experienced hikers who had hiked the Sierra Nevada mountains extensively. For them, Half Dome was not just another route, but a challenge they took on with the confidence of people familiar with the mountains. Among the participants was 16-year-old Brian Jordan, a young man from Hayward for whom the hike was to be one of his first serious ascents. Along for the ride were 24-year-old Robert Frith and Bruce Weiner of Mountain View, both new to mountain hiking and recently relocated to California. They were enthusiastic, even though they had no significant experience with such climbs. The group had prepared thoroughly for the hike. They had enough water, food, and basic gear for the day's climb. Reese and Esteban, as the more experienced participants, took on the role of guides, planning the route and controlling the pace. Their goal was not just to reach the summit. They wanted to share with the others the sense of triumph that comes with conquering one of America's most famous mountains. There was a special spirit in the group, a mixture of excitement and determination. For the newcomers, It was an opportunity to test themselves on a legendary route under the guidance of experienced comrades. For Rice and Esteban, it was a chance to show others the beauty and majesty of the mountains they loved so much. Neither of them could have guessed how this day would change their lives. The morning of July 27th was cloudless. Perfect climbing weather. The group set out from Happy Isles, beginning the long trek on a winding trail through the famous Mist Trail. The first few miles were easy, climbing past Vernal Fall, then a steep section to Nevada Fall, where they took a rest stop. Here at the rumbling waterfall, there was no sign of impending danger. By noon, the first signs of changing weather became visible on the eastern horizon. Clouds, typical of summer days in the Sierra Nevada, began to gather over Cloud's Rest Ridge. For experienced mountain hikers, this was a familiar signal. Weather can change rapidly in the mountains, especially in the afternoon. On the approach to Half Dome Junction, about 6.5 miles from the start of the trail, the group of 9 began to break up. The constant elevation gain and increasing difficulty of the trail tested everyone's stamina. 4 of the participants, after assessing their strength and growing fatigue, decided not to continue the climb. Perhaps their decision was also influenced by the disturbing clouds gathering on the horizon. In the mountains, the ability to turn back in time is often the key to survival. The remaining 5, Rice, Esteban, Jordan, Frith, and Weiner, continued on to Subdome, a steep section of granite steps. It was here they encountered a group of hikers descending. "There's a thunderstorm coming, best not to go up," the descenders warned them. But these words, instead of stopping the group, seemed to spur their determination to reach the top. Rice and Esteban, relying on their experience, quickly assessed the situation. Thunder could already be heard clearly from Cloud's Rest, but the summit seemed reachable. They decided to continue climbing, believing that they would be able to ascend and descend before the thunderstorm reached Half Dome. The newcomers, Frith and Weiner, trusted the experience of the leaders, while young Jordan was determined to test himself. This collective decision, made as the sky above them gradually darkened and the rolls of thunder grew closer and louder, was a turning point in their fate. By the time the group reached the base of the cables, around 5:40 p.m., the weather had changed dramatically. Dark clouds enveloped the sky, and the humid air was filled with electric tension. Lightning played over nearby ridges, and the rolls of thunder sounded closer and louder. At the foot of the cable section, they were met by a warning sign about the dangers of climbing during a thunderstorm. Half Dome, due to its height and special geological structure, is infamous as a natural lightning rod. Its smooth granite surface serves as an excellent conductor of electricity, and its elevation of nearly 5,000 feet above the valley makes it an ideal target for lightning. The National Park Service has recorded numerous incidents involving lightning strikes to this monolith, and each year rescuers evacuate dozens of hikers stranded on the summit during thunderstorms. The last 400 feet of the climb presented a nearly vertical granite surface. 2 parallel steel cables, installed as early as 1919, with wooden rungs every 10 feet, were the only safety net between the climbers and the abyss. Under normal conditions, this section required total concentration and physical strength. Now, under the impending thunderstorm, every step on the wet granite became a challenge. Rice was the first to start climbing the cables, followed by Esteban. A light rain had already begun to drizzle, making the granite slippery and the metal cables wet and cold. Frith and Weiner, despite their growing anxiety, kept moving, not wanting to fall behind the leaders. Brian Jordan, the youngest in the group, was the last to climb, trying to follow the movements of his more experienced comrades. Reaching the summit around 18 Niuau, the group found themselves in the open under an increasingly darkening sky. A thunderstorm was now directly above them, with lightning stripping the sky closer and closer to the summit. In their search for shelter, they found a natural rock niche on the southeast side of the summit, about 50 feet from the edge of the cable section. This recess in the granite, about 10 feet wide and 5 to 6 feet deep, seemed a relatively safe place to wait out the weather. All five huddled in the niche, drenched and tired, but still enthusiastic about reaching the summit. They had no way of knowing that this rock shelter, instead of an escape from the elements, would become a place where nature would demonstrate its inexorable power. At 6:30 p.m., nature demonstrated its relentless power. Thunder rolled over the top of Half Dome, and the next moment a blinding flash illuminated the stone niche. Lightning, drawn by thousands of tons of wet granite, struck directly into the rock shelter. The electrical discharge traveled through the rock, striking all five hikers. There was a deafening crackle in the enclosed space of the niche, and the air was filled with the pungent odor of ozone and burning hair. Time seemed to stand still. Brian Jordan, a 16-year-old boy from Hayward, leaning against the far wall of the alcove, was killed instantly, the discharge having passed through his body directly into the ground. Robert Frith, standing next to him, received a tremendous blow. His body began to shudder uncontrollably in convulsions. His muscles convulsed with electrical spasms. In a state of shock, his body moved uncontrollably to the edge of the niche. Adrian Esteban and Bruce Weiner, though partially paralyzed from the shock, tried to save their comrade. Esteban managed to grab Frith by his belt, Weiner by his jacket, but their own injuries and numb legs made it impossible to hold the weight of a grown man. Esteban's fingers unclenched first, then Feiner's hand slipped as well. Before their eyes, Frith, still convulsing, disappeared over the edge of the cliff, falling more than 2,000 feet. Tom Rice, who was against the opposite wall, suffered severe burns. His feet, pressed against the lightning-hot granite, were severely burned. Bruce Weiner was leaning over at the moment of impact, which paradoxically saved his life. The contact with the stone was minimal. Nevertheless, the discharge damaged his nervous system, causing paralysis in his legs and excruciating pain throughout his body. Adrian Esteban, who was barely in contact with the rock, suffered temporary paralysis of his lower limbs, but the psychological trauma of his comrades dying before his eyes was no less severe. The alcove, which had recently seemed a safe haven, was now a place of primal horror. The air was saturated with the odor of ozone and burning flesh. Brian Jordan's lifeless body lay frozen against the far wall, like a terrible reminder of the power of nature. The groans of the wounded mingled with the rumblings of the continuing thunderstorm, and somewhere far below, at the foot of Half Dome, lay the body of Robert Frith. The summit they were so eager to conquer had become the scene of a tragedy that forever changed the fates of all involved. After a devastating lightning strike, the survivors found themselves in a desperate situation. Esteban, realizing the danger of another strike, knew they must leave the niche. The atmospheric electricity still crackled in the air, and the wet granite continued to be the perfect conductor. In the gap between the clouds, Esteban spotted a depression in the rock about 150 feet from their hiding place, a spot known as the outhouse. Driven by an instinct for self-preservation, he began to slowly make his way toward this relatively safe spot, leaving his wounded comrades behind. Weiner and Rice remained in the alcove. Descending the wet cables in their condition was impossible, and traveling across the open top meant becoming a living target for lightning. Brian Jordan's body lay beside them, and somewhere far below were Frith's remains, a terrible reminder that any wrong decision could cost a life. As the storm began to subside, another group of hikers, delayed in Little Yosemite Valley by the weather, decided to continue the climb. Upon reaching the summit around 9 p.m., they heard cries for help. The group was lucky enough to have a man with emergency medical experience in the group, who was the first to answer the call. What he saw in the niche shocked even his experienced eye. Quickly assessing the situation, he first checked the pulse of the motionless Jordan, but it was too late. Jordan was dead. He then proceeded to examine Rice, whose burns required immediate attention. Weiner, despite his serious injuries, remained conscious and able to speak, which allowed details of what had happened to be learned. The rest of the hikers from the group that arrived acted coherently, as if they were a professional rescue team. They organized a temporary shelter from the still drizzling rain, using the available equipment. Some gave their jackets to warm the injured, others shared water and energy bars. One hiker, an experienced mountain trail runner, volunteered to go for help. He was to run several miles in the dark to the nearest ranger station. Despite the risks of running down wet trails at night, it was the only way to get professional help quickly. Esteban, hearing the voices of the arriving hikers, returned from his hiding place to the alcove. He was in a state of deep shock, constantly repeating the details of the tragedy. The tourists tried to calm him down, realizing that psychological trauma can be just as dangerous as physical injury. In the darkness of night, to the hushed rumblings of thunder, this motley group of almost strangers united in the fight for the victims' lives. While one of them rushed downstairs for help, the others did their best to support the survivors. They monitored the condition of the injured and tried to keep them warm and conscious. Around 9:30 p.m., a hiker-runner reached the ranger station and reported the tragedy at the top of Half Dome. The rangers immediately began preparations for a rescue operation. Despite darkness and the residual effects of the storm, the rescue team set off on an 8-mile trek to the summit on foot, realizing that every minute of delay could cost the lives of the victims. By midnight, the rangers reached the summit. In the dim light of the lanterns, they saw the gravity of the situation. Tom Rice lay semi-conscious. His legs, especially where they had made contact with the granite during the lightning strike, were covered with deep, third-degree burns. The skin was blackened and peeling off in places, exposing the damaged tissue. Every touch caused him excruciating pain, and the signs of shock were becoming more and more apparent. Bruce Weiner's condition was no less alarming. The lightning strike had severely damaged his nervous system. His lower body remained paralyzed, and his internal organs, especially his kidneys, showed signs of severe damage. His heart rate was unstable, which, combined with the kidney injury, required immediate specialized treatment. After a quick assessment of the situation, the Rangers made a decision. Both victims needed to be evacuated immediately to UC Davis Medical Center's Trauma Center, the only medical facility in the region capable of handling such complex injuries. The moon breaking through the parting clouds gave the air evacuation a chance. At around 1 a.m., the helicopter, balancing in conditions of limited visibility, made the first landing on the summit. The rescuers decided to first evacuate Weiner, whose condition caused the greatest concern. He was carefully moved onto a stretcher and loaded into the helicopter, which immediately set a course for the valley. 40 minutes later, the helicopter returned for Rice. The process of his transportation was complicated by severe burns. Every movement caused unbearable pain. After the second victim had been evacuated, the helicopter picked up Esteban, who, although he did not need a stretcher, was still in a state of shock. At dawn, around 6:30 a.m., the hardest part of the rescue operation, evacuating the victims, began. The first thing the helicopter did was to head to the foot of Half Dome, where the body of Robert Frith was to be found. The rescuers, using information from eyewitnesses and their experience in such situations, searched in the area where the rocks form a natural ledge, about 2,200 feet below the summit. Here, among the rock debris, they found the body of a young man from Mountain View. Using special equipment for working on steep slopes, rescuers rappelled down ropes to retrieve the body from the hard-to-reach ledge. The process of hoisting the body aboard the helicopter was difficult and required the full skill of both the ground crew and the pilot. The helicopter then returned to the summit to retrieve Brian Jordan's body. By this time, the parents of the deceased teenager had arrived at the park. His brother, having learned of the tragedy, insisted on riding up in the helicopter and personally accompanying the body. In the stone alcove that became 16-year-old Brian's final resting place, rescuers prepared the body for transportation with the utmost care and respect. Brian's brother, outwardly calm but with unspeakable pain in his eyes, assisted the rescuers, as if trying to take care of his younger brother one last time. Silently accompanied by his brother and the rescuers, Brian's body was carried downstairs where his parents were waiting for him. The rangers and the occasional first aid hikers acted as a team throughout that long night. Their coordinated actions, the professionalism of the rescuers and the courage of the helicopter pilot who risked a night flight in the mountains, saved the lives of the survivors. But even years of experience could not fully prepare them for the emotional impact of this tragedy, one of the most serious in Half Dome's history. After the tragic night on Half Dome, a long struggle to recover, both physically and mentally, began for the survivors. Tom Rice and Bruce Weiner were taken to UC Davis Medical Center, where doctors immediately began treating their severe injuries. Tom Rice's condition required intensive care. The deep burns on his legs required constant care and a series of surgeries. Weeks in the ICU were followed by months of rehabilitation. His recovery was slow and painful, but perseverance helped him get back to a normal life. Bruce Weiner spent about 3 weeks at UC Davis before being transferred to a Boston hospital for continued treatment in a specialized burn unit. Damage to his nervous system and kidneys left lasting effects. Years later, he admitted that the lightning strike changed his life forever, leaving not only physical scars but also a deep emotional mark. Adrian Esteban, though least seriously physically injured, faced a severe psychological ordeal. Guilt haunted him because he, as one of the experienced leaders of the group, supported the decision to continue the climb despite the storm. In later interviews, he admitted that he was plagued by nightmares about the fall of Frith and the death of young Jordan. The Los Angeles Times and other major publications covered the tragedy extensively, bringing public attention to safety issues in national parks. However, despite the magnitude of the tragedy, there were no significant changes to Half Dome climbing regulations. The National Park Service limited itself to reinforcing warnings about the dangers of thunderstorms and adding new warning signs at the base of the cable route. Brian Jordan's family took the loss of their son hard. They did not pursue legal action against the park, realizing that the tragedy was the result of a fateful confluence of circumstances and human decisions, not systemic safety deficiencies. This tragedy was a stark reminder that even experienced hikers can underestimate the forces of nature, and that decisions made in the mountains sometimes have irreversible consequences. The 1985 tragedy at Half Dome was not the last reminder of the power of nature. Nearly 40 years later, in July 2024, a similar story played out on the same cables. 20-year-old Grace Roloff, an experienced hiker from Arizona, died during her descent when a sudden rainstorm turned the granite surface into a death trap. Half Dome's history continues to attract thousands of hikers each year. Since the permit system was introduced in 2010, the number of ascenders has been limited to 225 tourists per day. But this has not reduced the risks associated with sudden changes in weather. Statistics show that there have been over a dozen fatalities at Half Dome since the 1980s, and lightning remains a major hazard. The events of 1985 changed the perception of Half Dome in the minds of many. For park rangers, the tragedy was a textbook example of how quickly weather conditions can turn an ordinary climb into a disaster. For rescuers, it was a reminder of the importance of quick response and teamwork in critical situations. Survivors of the tragedy have dealt with its aftermath in different ways. Some, like Tom Rice and Adrian Esteban, returned to the Half Dome the following year, perhaps to confront their fears or to honor their fallen comrades. Bruce Weiner, though recovered from his physical injuries, admitted that the events of that day forever changed his relationship to mountains and nature. Today, the trail to Half Dome features better warning signs and weather forecasts have become more accurate. But the basic elements of the trail, granite steps and steel cables, remain much the same as they were in 1985. They continue to test the determination of travelers, reminding them that in the fight between man and nature, the elements always have the last word. The story of the 1985 tragedy is passed down among hikers and climbers as a warning. It teaches us that even the most experienced traveler must respect the forces of nature, and that any decision in the mountains can have irreversible consequences. Half Dome remains not only a symbol of the majesty of American nature, but also a reminder of the high price sometimes paid for the desire to conquer its peaks. The tragedy at Half Dome raises complex questions for which there are no easy answers. What makes experienced hikers ignore obvious signs of danger? Where is the line between courage and recklessness? And most importantly, who is responsible when the passion for adventure collides with the inexorable forces of nature? Perhaps you yourself have found yourself in a situation where you had to choose between prudent retreat and the desire to achieve the goal at any cost. Share your experience in the comments. What decision did you make and why? What would you have done if you were Rice and Esteban? Would you have kept climbing, knowing that the summit was only a short distance away? Or would you have turned back when you saw the storm approaching? If you like this story, please support our channel by liking and subscribing. There are many more exciting wilderness survival stories to come, each one reminding us, sometimes the hardest decision is the decision to turn back. Thanks for watching, and see you in future episodes.